Welcome to another Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with my co host, the wonderful, the effervescent, the carbonated Anthony Marchetta. Anthony, how are you doing today?
I am fantastic.
Excellent. It must be the carbonation.
Yes.
Today, we are talking about uh, good authors who make bad decisions. And we're just going to talk about the industry in general because, as much as we are the vanguard of the Christian right wing authorship, true masters of our craft, and the absolute captains of literary destiny, we do have many gripes and many things that we struggle with here. And we're going to talk about them and complain about good authors with absolutely horrible books that we personally hate. Uh,
Hmm.
yes.
Yeah, this was sprung. This idea was sprung on me a bit, so I'm still going through my mental map of authors and thinking. So, you can go first while I try and work out a good example.
Oh, of course.
Oh, I have one, but go ahead.
Yes. So for me, I love the Redwall series. The Redwall series is absolutely amazing. You need to, uh, you absolutely need to read it
Read
for
it, man.
yourselves.
Read it.
The show ain't bad, and there's even some audibles that are narrated by the man himself with his acting troupe. Uh, Hold on a second. Like he
I'm
he
waiting.
literally has an acting troupe that follows him around from audible to audible. So you get the author himself, who is a radio broadcast, personality and actor, who also writes his own books, acting out his own books with the same people across multiple episodes. So like Martin Matthias, Matameo, and others all get the same voice actor. So you actually get a great, like the audibles are actually like an amazing way to experience the book. It's not the ideal way; the books are amazing, but like because they're also their audio quality is sometimes a little dodgy. But um, you get a great view in how the author, views what's tension, what's not, you know, what's menacing, that may not have been communicated in the books and so on because I'm certainly a fan of authorial intent in many different books and projects. Um, but he has a black mark, a horrible, utterly disgusting, wretched black mark that I personally hate with a passion you guys cannot understand. And it's not because I personally hate Brian Jakes. It is because The Bellmaker is an absolutely wretched book that deserves all the scorn that it will receive from me. And the reason why I hate it is absolutely multitudinous in reason. All right, you have to understand like this stuff will never end. Um, so a little bit of backstory. This is the sequel to a book called Mariel of Redwall. Mariel of Redwall is just I think it's the fourth book in the Redwall series. Where he gets away from the trio of Martin, Matthias, and Matameo, and goes to sort of expand the world a bit with unknown characters. Martin is long dead and buried after the events of Mossflower, and so on and so forth. Um, but at the same time, Martin and Methuselah and others have not been born yet, so they, aren't a part of the story. There's no recognizable characters. Uh, there's some weird stuff that comes up that doesn't really come up again, but it doesn't matter as much. I'm not really going to go over that. That's not what's offensive. Mariel is a little bit as a person. Uh, it's a little bit, I wouldn't want to say feminist, but it was like action girly, that sort of thing. And it does kind of, not really show up again in the same way as it with other additions to the book series. So that just to make that clear. So you have some things that I would consider warning signs in any other author. Uh, the action orientation for the female, the how they do new things with the formula without, shall we say, properly grounding it yet, and other things like that. It would be like me writing a episode of Pinkerton's Ghosts with a subject that I have not studied properly for horror. Or if I make it more like Monster Hunter International rather than how I write Pinkerton's Ghosts. So he writes a couple more books. Salamandastron is pretty good. Uh, Martin the Warrior is an absolute banger, one of the best in the series, an absolute tour de force, an amazing book. Um, Great characters, heartwarming, heart wrenching, so on and so forth. So he's going from peak, to peak. You have the original Redwall trilogy that's 10 out of 10. Mariel, Salamandastron, ooh. Then Martin the Warrior, like, nice. Right? And then you hit Bellmaker. And Bellmaker just goes, you know, no survivors. There were several politicians on that plane just after they talked about the funding the CIA. Like, this is a wreck. There are no survivors. And so the reasoning is that I've paused my game so I can now think about this stuff. Uh, the reasoning why I hate this book so much, but I still tortured myself with it, is because a lot of things come easy and a lot of things interfere with rules that are applied without creating um, a lot of value. His characters are not so like you have it as a sequel. It is not part of the main canon, and it has other things going for it, like it introduces new places and doesn't mention old places that would be mentioned, especially since they're like friends and stuff like that. So, first, in every sequel that you have a problem of characterization. You must keep the characterization at least passably connected to each other from book to book. The problem is that Brian Jakes either forgot or did not care that Roof Brush was a certain kind of character and very stoic kind of guy. And then in Mariel of Redwall, he was not a young squirrel. He was kind of a squirrel reaching his adulthood. Doesn't talk that much. And then all of a sudden he's weeping all the time. He's yelling. He's doing this. He's talking. Oh, I'm scared for the future. It's like, buddy, you were under siege with by sea rats in the first book, and you murdered the survivors with Oak Tom and a few other characters. You absolutely destroyed them. You know, you did things and killed people. How are you now this weepy? Other characters are kind of along for the ride. And I would even say that they didn't need to have Redwall in the book at all, except for perhaps contractual obligations. In every Redwall book, there's always the hero, who is, shared among a couple characters. But in this case, it's shared between Mariel Dandon, Joseph the Bellmaker, Meldrum the Magnificent, and quite a few other people all in the same book with different perspectives ramming together. Burly Pen Tips, who only shows up in the beginning and end for a reason, like just because it's like, oh, I've got too many characters. Yeah, he's just hanging out with the moles. With Meldrum the Magnificent's nephews. Yeah, that's right. That'll solve the question. Uh, he throws stale food to knock people unconscious. It's such a bad shtick. And that's the thing. For the new characters, he has two badass otters, sea captain types, Rab Stream Battle and Finbar Galedeep. He kills Finbar Galedeep for no reason. Like he fights Ergen Nagru, the villain, who I'm going to get to eventually, and he's killed by somebody stabbing him in the back with a spear, which is fairly realistic. He charged into the enemy ranks and he was surrounded on all sides. Okay, but at the same time, there's no emotional payoff to it, and I don't even think that he had any connection to the main villain. Like, I think Brian Jakes may have like mixed them up and then fixed it post editing because he decided he didn't want to kill Rab Stream Battle, even though he faked out a death on Rab Stream Battle earlier. So you have that kind of like weird emotional push. Joseph the Bellmaker was told to take some guys and go down to South Sword to save his daughter by a dream with Martin the Warrior. Okay, except you know he he doesn't he it barely does anything. Like it's unnecessary. It's very unnecessary in the plot, but they still went for it. You have the story of Slip and Blackgut, who show up. They're adopted into the Redwallers, even though they're sea rats. They murder a beloved character, and well, Slip does. Blackgut's kind of bullied into the ride because he is a weak-willed, possibly autistic sea rat. Uh, and eventually, it just kind of comes to nothing, and now he's just hanging out on the coast, and he shows up in the end to tell people that Mariel and others have come home. It's very why. It's like why did these characters do this? Why did the characters exist here? Okay, so then we go on to the villain. The villain, the Urgan Nagru, is possibly the worst villain in the Redwall series. So we'll compare him to Gabul the Wild from Mariel of Redwall. So Gabul the Wild is absolutely crazy. He is a crazy, insane sea rat who is getting crazier all the time. He had his teeth ripped out and replaced with gold and gem and studded teeth. He's got this bell he's obsessed over. That's the main point of the plot, and all this other stuff. Like he is an absolute character. He is a presence. He's like a Jack Sparrow with absolutely no morality and a whole lot more murder and insanity. All right, so you have this interesting, wild-eyed character who's insane and interesting, and he's dueling his captains who he believes are traitors to him. Like there's a whole lot of intrigue. The Urgan Nagru, they don't give him any tension at all. Like Gabul has all this tension. He's murdered or at least tried to murder two main characters in the opening chapters, and he did a pretty good job of it, except that they were fated to live. The Urgan Nagru has no tension to him. His first show up is him bickering with his wife Silvermord as they torment the Squirrel King of Southsword. And I'm not talking like Lord Vader, Darth Vader, like sending in the interrogator drone to break Leia. I'm saying that it's more like, yeah, dance for us, monkey, sort of thing. Dance for us, Badger. So you have like a villain who is not very intimidating. Now, when he's in the fight, Brian Jakes pulls it together. Urgan Nagru is a force on the battlefield, and he actually makes some sound strategic decisions once he's actually in a fight. So, there's a little bit there. But the thing is that we've spent the entire book seeing him bumble around and getting henpecked by his wife. There's nothing there to root for. Nothing there to really, go for it. He's a fox who wears a wolf pelt. Okay, he's got iron claws. All right, does he use them? No, not really. Um, it's not even what kills the guy who kills themselves to try and kill him. Like it's not even, you know, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna torture these people, and they just immediately escape. Like so, there's no tension with the main villain. There's no tension with the other adventures. Like they hijack a sea rat ship and then pilot it through a maelstrom, destroying the pursuing sea rat ship, uh, and proceed to have all these like different adventures, which usually I am for sea adventures. I am absolutely rocking sea adventures. I love sea adventure. But somehow he didn't make it fun. Brian Jakes has worked as a sailor. His other stories that involve sailing ships absolutely kills it. He's clearly a man who knows his business. But for some reason, he just loses all his marbles for this one. So, characters. So then there's a question of like prophecies and stuff like that. One of the main things that has a Redwall, makes a Redwall story is riddles and sort of dreams and the spiritual nature of Martin the warrior protecting the abbey from beyond death. Okay, that's a reasonable thing to have. But then it's like, yeah, four guys are going to go, and you're going to go to the south. And like it's one of those things where you just read it and I'm like, yeah, I this is a horrible riddle. And like looking at it compared to like Redwall's riddles, compared to the Pearls of Lutra riddles, compared to all these other ones, even the nonsense songs that are sung in Outcasts of Redwall, there's nothing there. There's no character. There's no plot. The stakes are all wacky. I don't know or care enough about these places. There's not enough character. Like Mossflower is a character that you can feel from Redwall page one. You can't feel the same with Southsward. At times it's got forests, and then it's hilly, and then there's dunes, but at the same time it's all like a day's march from each other, and there's no sense of scale for it. Like all of a sudden, so Ergen Nagru takes over Gale Squirrel King's castle, but then all of a sudden, like he's got like 200 squirrels willing to fight with him for the final battle. Like, how long has this been going on? Is this just like a couple days? Has he only just showed up there a day ago, and nobody's had time to react to him or something? Like, and then the other people find 100 otters over here, and then there's like 80 moles who wield iron mallets and stuff like that. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff like what? Where were these guys? Like you know whenever Ergen Nagru showed up and took over the place, you know there's all the there's an implication that he's just done it recently, but at the same time, like it shows up, but it's never hinted at beforehand. And Mossflower is a pretty empty place. But the thing is that people are always coming and going, and there's always squirrels and other people and hedgehogs running around. So there's, even though it's like, yeah, we walked for a day, didn't meet anyone, but then it's like, yeah, we found these tribes of hedgehogs on the water. There's a sense of abandonment, but also there's a sense of it actually being full of life once you get to where the life is. But in Southport, there's nothing there. There's no good riddles. There's no good songs, really. There's no good characters, even though Finbar Gale Deep is probably the guy who really, him and Rab Stream Battle, are the two guys who really hold the book on their shoulders. It's still absolutely miserable to get through it. None of the characters carry over from the sequels. And then like the book after that is Outcast of Redwall, which is an absolute banger. Outcast of Redwall, Long Patrol, Marl Fox, Legend of Luke, Lord Brocktree, and Tagarung are all absolute bangers of books. Even the ones that aren't really as good, like the Long Patrol kind of, and Legend of Luke kind of, are still like easy 8 out of 10s. Like it's like Redwall's a 10 out of 10, Mossflower's a 9 out of 10, Matameo's a 9.5 out of 10. Then you have Mariel, which is like an 8 out of 10. Salamandastron's also an 8 out of 10. Um, Martin the Warrior is another 10 out of 10. Possibly one of the best books in the series. Possibly the best book in the series, I should say. Then you have like the Bellmaker, which is not a book I would finish reading if it was just by itself. In fact, it is the book of Redwall that I have read the least out of all the books. And then you have Outcast of Redwall, which is like a 9 out of 10. Like all the books up until past Tagarung, because Triss is like a 7. Uh, is like an 8, 9, 10 out of 10. Brocktree is a 10 out of 10. Like it vies with Redwall, Martin the Warrior, and Lord Brocktree, Martin the Warrior, and Redwall are like the possibly 3 truly great books, like as Redwall books. So it's not like I'm saying, well, the crap was there. No, 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 no. I'm saying that this book, this specific book, is full of terrible decisions. I don't know if it was a change in editors. I don't know if he was like dealing with an illness. I don't know if there's just something that like is missing and people actually love the Bellmaker, and I don't know what's going on. But this is like, if someone had said this is the first book in the Redwall series and had handed it to me, I wouldn't read the rest of the Redwall series. Like it's hard to explain, how much I just dislike this book, even though I'm trying now, just because he doesn't follow his own rules. He doesn't make it interesting. He doesn't make it worthwhile reading. Maybe because of its runaway success, they were trying to force out a book or something, which I could see. But you have this classic author puts out a bad book, and it's just an absolute stinker of a book, like a 3 out of 10, that drives me up a wall and back down again. Like I love the books that come before and after it. Like he goes from Martin the Warrior to the Bellmaker. Like, how do you do that? I don't understand. Maybe the Martin the Warrior just took it all out of him, because you know, because I see that. I believe that authors, when they make a truly great book, they do have to sort of spend time healing from it before entering into their next big project that they want to, um, that they want to really push. But
The Bellmaker does have good reviews on Amazon, but all of the Redwall books do, so I
yep,
think it's just being reviewed as it's the next book in the Redwall series. I like Redwall.
yep,
Yeah, 5 stars.
yep, and like,
Like, I don't know how much it means.
yeah, like, to be clear, it isn't like as bad as a skin suit product or anything like that, but it's clearly lesser than all the other books in the series. Like, there's a drop off after Tagarung, where Triss and other ones, while not being horrible books, are just not as good as any of the books that came before. They're not really worth reading. There's some weird ideas. It's clear that he's trying to play with the ideas and do something new, but he just can't do it. The story isn't there, isn't unique enough, doesn't have the beef that a story of Redwall's quality needs. And the Bellmaker is very much like that. Like, it has all the pieces, but they are absolutely mangled every time he uses them. And I believe he was more of an Iraqi character where he made practical decisions. But at the same time, like, there's switching parts in JoJo versus, like, because to be clear, like, if someone's like, well, the continuity in JoJo, I'm going to put my finger to their lips and say, shh, it doesn't matter. It does not matter nearly as much as you think.
Yeah, but in JoJo, you kind of got to take each story on its own merits, right?
Yep,
Like, uh, the continuity does not entirely add up, but you're
yep,
going to JoJo's for very specific things, and those things Araki does very well. It's sort of, there are certain works where I wouldn't necessarily say these are the greatest things ever created, but what I would say is you will not get the experience of this work anywhere else.
yep,
Right? JoJo's is in that category where it's like it's JoJo's, technically speaking, the best work that I have ever read. No, even at its best, I wouldn't say that.
right,
But what I would say is you will not find anything else that is like JoJo.
yep,
Like, you're only going to get the experience of reading JoJo by reading JoJo. Like,
Yes.
so that's where I would put it. I'd say the same thing too about like it's a video game, but it's a visual novel. So, the Phoenix Wright games, right? Like, the
Yes.
Phoenix Wright games are absolutely not perfect. I've never seen anybody claim that they were, but you won't find anything like playing a Phoenix Wright game from anything else unless it's specifically imitating it.
Yep. And it's for a lot of this stuff with like Redwall and other things, you might want to say, well, it's a long running series, it's different ideas, he was an old man. But it's like, no, 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 the tone is kept in the books that happen after this one. Therefore, it's reasonable for me to expect that the thing that he's going for, must still be there. There's still the author's responsibility to their reader to provide a good product, and to do that, you do have to make sure that the product is worth reading at all times. That and more. Hmm. Yep. That exhausts my rant about the Bellmaker. Absolutely wretched book. Uh, you don't read it. Like, just don't read it. Um, you don't. It doesn't have any plot points. The characters never show up again. Um, these things just aren't important. South Sword never shows up again, to my knowledge. Uh, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I since I haven't read the book, I can't comment directly on it. Unfortunately, it's
It's all
sad.
right.
I can talk about my answer. So, thinking this over, there are a few things you could do. There's the case files of Sherlock Holmes. Anybody? So I've read all 60 of the original Sherlock Holmes stories. I am multiple times. I am a big Sherlock Holmes fan. But it is well known among all and sundry that the best Sherlock Holmes stuff runs up to the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yep.
Really, right? Like, uh, the adventures, the memoirs, and then Hound of the Baskervilles is sort of postscript
Yep.
is the best of Sherlock Holmes, and of course the two novels, A Study in Scarlet and particularly The Sign of Four, which is almost as good as The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's a brilliant mystery novel.
Mm.
In my opinion, it's sometimes underrated and overlooked, but the after that, the stories notably drop in quality. I once read a review that said Conan Doyle is fascinating in that he is an author whose character, like, he created his own character's own Golden Age, Silver Age, and Iron Age. Like, which is an interesting way of thinking of it, but I think fundamentally correct. You
Yep.
get the Silver Age of Sherlock Holmes, which is the return of Sherlock Holmes. The return is well received by longtime Sherlock fans, like on forums and things. A lot of the stories rank with the best. I don't agree. I think that the return is of noticeably lower quality. Uh, Quite frankly, it is hard for me to remember any stories from the return of Sherlock Holmes. Like, none of them really stick out to me. Even the empty house, I probably would have forgotten about if it weren't for the fact that that was the story where Holmes returns.
Mm-hmm.
It does admittedly have a pretty clever twist in it, which I will give it, which is that, they're looking for the perfect vantage point to spy on the killer who is trying to assassinate Holmes. But of course, because they needed to find the perfect vantage point to find him, that also happened to be the same spot that the killer was in, uh, because he came to the same conclusion that they did, which is a pretty funny twist. Uh,
Yes.
I will give the empty house that much credit. As an explanation for Holmes coming back is infamous for being full of holes. Uh, Probably because Conan Doyle didn't intend to bring Holmes back.
Yep.
Like
He's
it's
like,
really
how
that
much
simple.
money? Yes, absolutely. No problem.
Yeah, the story goes that he he did it to spite his mother, who he had like a tense relationship with. Uh, right, like that. His
Amazing.
mother basically said, "You can't bring him back," and he said, "Oh yeah, watch me." The funniest one to me, well, that is an amusing reason to do it. The funniest reason to me is from the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, which was from his last book of stories.
Hmm.
He was like entirely done with Sherlock Holmes. He did not want to write anymore. So he threw out, when they asked him what it would take for him to return, he threw out an obviously absurd amount of money, thinking that that would get them to shut up, and they matched it. Uh, so now, locked in by his own words and a sense of honor, he did in fact write the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. The casebook is a little bit it's weird because it's almost like, and now he tried to end Holmes so many times, right? He tried
Right.
to end it with the final problem. He tried to end it with the Hound of the Baskervilles. He tried to end it with his last bow, all of which would have made good endings for the character, right? I even think his last bow is mostly pretty good, right?
Hmm.
For what it is. Uh, all of which would have made fine endings for the character. Even the final problem is probably one of the weaker stories, if not the weakest story in the adventures and the memoirs, because a lot of the action happens off screen. But when I reread it years later, there is like a lot of very propulsive action in it. Like it
Hmm.
carries a very suspenseful tone. Uh, it would have been nice if Moriarty had been introduced before that story, but that was the nature of the game at the time, right? Like Conan Doyle didn't really do long form setups and payoffs. That just wasn't how he worked. Uh, so you had to accept that when he said, "Oh, it's really Moriarty who's running all crime in England," that he meant it,
Yep.
right? So it wasn't as bad of a story as I recalled when I originally read it. The final problem. So you get to the casebook, and the casebook is just like and another collection of stories, and they're very strange. Is the best way that I could describe it. Particularly, one of the stories is, in my opinion, the worst story in the entire Sherlock Holmes canon. But I've always had a soft spot for it because of how freaking weird it is. It's a very strange story. It's called The Lion's Mane, and it is about Holmes's retirement, right? So Holmes is retired. He is narrating the story, not Watson. Watson's not in it. He's not dead. He makes a point of saying that Watson is alive, but he's not in the story. Holmes has retired to keep bees in Sussex on the coast. Uh, and someone is killed by with and has a pattern all over him, and his last words are the lion's mane. And Holmes concludes that it was a lion's mane jellyfish. Now, the fascinating thing about the story are the many, many holes in it and the ongoing debate about whether or not these holes were intentionally put in by Conan Doyle to like make a point
Hmm.
of, like to indicate to the reader that Holmes is not entirely telling the truth and that the real truth is something else, or if they literally are just plot holes. Now, the evidence in favor of it not being plot holes and it being intentionally placed by Conan Doyle is that Conan Doyle always said that he was very fond of this story and ranked it among his favorite stories. Which, on the other hand, that could be somewhat understandable of an author at the end of a long career, satisfied at having come up and finished something that was a little bit different. You know, like that could just be why.
Mm-hmm.
But it is notable that, like, why was he so satisfied with this particular story? Yeah. But the case files are weak. They're very unmemorable. Uh, they do have a couple of famous scenes in them. In particular, they have one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes lines that unfortunately was supplanted in fame by the Sherlock TV show's reimagining of the line that gutted it of its original meaning, which was it was a absolutely I would say like a trite story that involved like circus freaks and a lion mauling someone, and Holmes figures it out. The story itself, I don't even remember it. Uh, and he's talking to the woman who wears a veil over her face, and you learn that this is because at some point in the story she had been mauled by a lion and was disfigured. And after Holmes tells her that she's figured out the story, she said, she's figured out the mystery. She thanks him, but in a very strange voice, and goes to leave. And Holmes suddenly stops her because he realizes what's going on, and he gives her a very famous and justly famous line. Your life is not your own. Keep your hands off it. Uh, Now, what people don't realize, mostly because of the Sherlock TV show, unfortunately, is that Holmes was not an atheist. Like, not at all was he an atheist. He was very far from an atheist. He never really indicated that he was a Christian, and Conan Doyle was not a Christian. He was a spiritualist.
Mm.
He believed in fairies and things like that. But Holmes never really indicated a specific belief in a Christian God, but he absolutely indicated and he also, by the way, never really indicated a belief in spiritualism either. The one time, the
Yes.
closest that Conan Doyle dabbles with this in the stories is in The Hound of the Baskervilles, and as it turns out, there's a natural explanation for everything going on. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so Holmes never indicates that he's a spiritualist either. But he does multiple times very, very strongly indicate his belief in God. He even criticizes atheism a couple times in passing. Uh, so when he says your life is not your own, keep your hands off it. In the Sherlock TV show, they give Sherlock a little monologue where he's like, think of all of the other people who you're going to affect if you die. Like, your life is not your own. Now, the problem with this as an appeal to someone is that if you are at the point where you are considering suicide and somebody tells you your life is not your own, keep your hands off it, think of all of the other people you love, is that my experience with talking with the people who have undergone that, and I have known, unfortunately, several. Thank God I have not been one of them. But I have known, unfortunately, several people who have been in that mindset, and I've tried to talk them down and talk them through it and things like that. It's a subject that matters to me. If
Mm.
I were to tell them that, it would not change anything because they think that they are making their lives of their families better by dying. Like, this is a
Yes.
part of their belief system almost universally. I have never talked to someone who is suicidal who said, I just don't care what my family will think. Their thought process is there is suffering going on, right? I am causing a lot of suffering. They're sick with worry about me. If I kill myself, it will end all of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? They won't need to worry about me. If you were to tell them, no, your life is not your own, their response would be, I know, right? Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
the point. My life is not my own. It also belongs to them. I'm removing that responsibility from the world.
Yes.
So the notable thing here is that Sherlock Holmes in the story does not make that appeal. That is not the point of the line. In fact, the dialogue after it is uh, it's very notable. She says something to Holmes along the lines of, like, what is the purpose of me being here, or something like that. Like, what do I bring to the world? And Holmes responds, who knows? It's not up to you to decide. In other words, it's up to God to make that decision of, your value to the world, not you. His point was your life is not your own, it belongs to God. And he says, who knows why you need to be here? Perhaps your example of suffering is enough for people, which is an astonishing thing to say, right? You could
Yep.
never say that nowadays. Never. But that's what he tells her. He says, maybe it's your example of suffering can show people how to bear suffering in the world. And she says to him, can you bear it? And removes her veil. And Watson says something like her face was so horrible that even though I didn't want to, even I had to look away, and Holmes just put up his hand in pity, and she walked out. But a few weeks later, Holmes gets something in the mail, and it is a bottle of poison and a note from the woman that says, I've decided to take your advice. So
Mm.
she does not kill herself. This is in an otherwise incredibly unmemorable story, but that's sort of the thing that you get when you get to the case files of Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
You get these individual ideas that are definitely interesting and are probably why he decided to turn it into a story, but the full story is not fleshed out around it, right?
Mm.
Like this whole section is great. I would say it's one of the more memorable moments in the entire Sherlock Holmes canon. And the line "Your life is not your own, keep your hands off it" is a brilliant line, justly famous. But the whole story doesn't really do enough to back it up. And you get other things like this in there. Like there's the famous scene where Watson is shot, and he is shot, but it's not serious. He says he was just grazed. But Holmes sees him and he says, "For God's sake, are you hurt?" And his lip quivers. And Watson says something like, "It was worth a wound. It was worth 100 wounds to see the depths of devotion that Holmes truly had for me." And then Holmes like looks over to the dude who shot Watson and says like, "You are very lucky that Watson is not seriously injured, or you wouldn't have left this room alive." Uh, so it's a famous scene, but again, I recall like nothing else of of that story, right? Like
Right.
the scene is famous in a sense. Like I've heard people go, it justifies the inclusion of the case files on its own. Personally, I don't really agree with this. It actually makes Holmes sound incredibly condescending to me. Uh, and it makes Watson sound like kind of an idiot. Uh, what?
Right.
Oh,
Who is
Holmes
a
cried.
soldier, fought in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
exactly. And he's like, "Oh, Holmes cried when he saw me shot. It was all worth it to know that Holmes liked me after all. Like I would have done it all again just for Daddy Holmes to praise me." It was a little weird to me.
Yes.
Uh but then that's kind of the problem with Watson in the stories overall. The truth is, and I hate to say it, like people go like, "Oh, this idea of Watson as an idiot isn't supported in the stories." It is, because the stories are not very consistent on how smart Watson is.
Right.
Uh,
It's like he's a doctor, and it's like a battlefield doctor, though.
eh, uh, yeah, the stories are actually pretty inconsistent on how intelligent Watson is. That's why I don't really have a problem with like Nigel Bruce. And in fact, in the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a very good movie, Nigel Bruce's Watson actually shows more spine than the book version of Watson. Like in the book, Watson learns that Holmes has actually been hiding out on the moor the entire time, and that the letters he thought he was sending back to Holmes were just like being rerouted to the moor, where Holmes was waiting for them.
Right.
And at first, Watson is about to get like really annoyed at this, and then Holmes is like, "Relax, I've kept all the letters. They've been very helpful." And he like pulls them out, and Watson calms down a bit. In the movie, at least the Nigel Bruce version of Watson is still like annoyed at this. You know, he's like, "Yeah, but come on, that's insulting. Like you could have told me." It's like, really,
Right.
you didn't trust me enough to tell me that you were doing this? Like I couldn't keep a secret? Like, which I think is actually a more than fair reaction to what Holmes did.
Yes.
Uh,
I've never
but
understood that for some of it. It's like, Holmes, for like certain people, it's like you're completely loyal. There's no question of loyalty. And, I assume that Watson, would never let drop, some secret that Holmes did not want to, let drop uh, in this. So it's
he
like,
wouldn't. I will say this though, it is in character for Holmes.
yeah,
Uh, it's the sort of like, there are certain moments in the stories where Holmes is remarkably callous in a, well, you got to do the most logical thing sort of way, and it's more logical if I trust only myself instead of you. Like one of the stories, which I think is one of the better later stories, by the way, is The Dying Detective, where Holmes convinces Watson he is dying of some rare tropical disease. Uh, and he does this basically so that Watson will sell it. Uh, right? But
right,
to be fair to Watson and to Holmes, he says the reason I had to pick a rare tropical disease and wouldn't let you see me is that I knew that as soon as you observed me up close, you would be able to tell that I was faking it. Uh, and Watson is like, oh, well, I guess that compliment is enough to make up for the fact that you literally convinced me that you were on death's door. Uh, which this is kind of a thing with Watson. I think sometimes he comes off as a little bit too forgiving of Holmes. I also think it's really interesting when you read the Sign of Four. Like the Sign of Four, I would argue that Watson is more of the main character in the Sign of Four than Holmes is, and the story is primarily a romance between Watson and Mary Morstan, and quite a good one. Uh,
Mm,
I always thought of the Sign of Four as like it's very interesting because it sort of speaks of an alternate world where Watson could have been a main character in his own right and
yep.
been very entertaining in his own right, but that's not the route that Conan Doyle went down. Uh, because he absolutely he is the principal character of the Sign of Four. Sure, it's Holmes who was hired on the investigation. He's helping him out, but the fundamental character conflict is Watson's relationship with Mary Morstan, who is the person who Holmes is working for, right?
Yes.
And this is the final note that we leave the novel off on. Well, I guess second final note. The final note is Watson tells Holmes he's moving in with Mary Morstan, and Holmes gets depressed and says he's gonna shoot himself up with cocaine. Uh, this is real. This is real. I'm not making that up even slightly. I'm not even exaggerating it. Uh, that's exactly what happens. But the funny thing, that wasn't really what I intended to bring up because I think the case files, everybody kind of knows, right? That the case files are lesser work. Everybody knows that the adventures and the memoirs are where it's at. Uh, what I was going to bring up, so one of my favorite authors is Stephen Lawhead. And Stephen Lawhead has written several series that I'm a huge fan of. Uh, did he write in the Hall of the Dragon King? I think he did. I'm double checking. In the Hall of the Dragon King. I'm double checking that was Lawhead. Yeah, it was. Yeah, he wrote the Dragon King trilogy, which has one of the all-time great titles in the Hall of the Dragon King,
Yes.
which I greatly enjoyed. I loved his Robin Hood series, Hood, Scarlet, and Tuck. I thought was excellent. And the first thing I read by him was his Pendragon Cycle. So his Pendragon Cycle is a 5 to 6 book, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment, series. Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, Pendragon, and Grail, and then a sixth book called Avalon, which is really what I want to discuss. Now, the Pendragon series is not perfect. Some of it is Lawhead's fault, and some of it isn't. His publisher dropped the series. Uh, so after his publisher dropped the series, a new he was forced to conclude the series early, and you could tell in that the ending is definitely more rushed than he wanted. But then a new publisher picked it up, and he was able to write like two in between books. So I did I took a recommended reading path to it, and I read the uh, first two books and the first two sections of the last book. Then I read Pendragon and Grail in between it, which fit in between uh, the first two sections of the last book and the last section of the last book. And then I read the last book of Arthur to finish up the series. Now, overall, I think that the Pendragon cycle is very, very strong. It has a strong Christian core to it. And there are some incredibly memorable scenes. One of my favorites is from Arthur when Arthur is going around winning battles and things. The whole point is that Arthur is winning these battles against usurpers to the throne, invaders against impossible odds with brilliant military stratagems, and he's been betrayed, and now it looks as if all of his work is on the verge of being undone in this one battle, and his army is retreat. He needs to assault a city, and take the city, and if he doesn't, if he retreats his army, uh, then all of the work that he's done over the past several years and years of battles might end up being undone. And if he doesn't retreat, it is quite probable his army will be destroyed. So everybody is waiting to see what is Arthur going to do. Like, what brilliant military stratagem is he going to come up with? So he's outside of the city, and he comes out to speak to the crowd, his assembled army, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he tells them, this is at night, the night before, or the night before, he tells them that the only way that they can take the city is through faith in Jesus Christ, the true King of all, and that in order to do this, they need the favor of the Most High God. And so he is going to make an example by getting baptized right there in the ocean, in front of them all, and that he expects all who are not already baptized in his army to line up and get baptized, for that is the only path to victory. And he does, and the whole army joins in after him, and all who are not already baptized get baptized in the waters of the ocean. And then Merlin steps out, who was there at the battle as an advisor, and he announces to the assembled men that they must build a wall of prayer, and that is how they will win victory. So they all sleep, and they wake up in the morning, and Arthur is lugging rocks out behind the army. And then the generals of the army are all confused, and who are various knights of the round table, like Bedivere and things like that. And you see, they one by one, they each go out to Arthur, confused at what he's doing, and Arthur talks with them for a moment, and they nod, and then they all start joining him. And then they go, I don't, you see what's happening, and they go, what's he doing? And go, he's taking Merlin's advice. He's building a wall. It's like, what? He's like, Merlin said he needed to build a wall. He's building a wall. He's doing what Merlin said. And all of the generals join him. And the city that they're going to take is watching what's going on. At first, they start mocking him, like, what on earth are you doing? Why would you waste your time with this? It's ridiculous. But then, as the day goes on, and they don't stop, and they don't charge the city, but they also don't leave, and the people of and the army in the city starts to get afraid, because Arthur isn't just building a wall; he is building a wall to surround his army. And the only reason you would ever block off your own escape route is if you're assured of victory. So they start to get afraid that Arthur has some sort of trick up his sleeve that he is going to use to win the battle. And the battle ends with it's night and the wall has been built, and they're praying outside the wall, and the tension of the army in the city becomes too great, and they can't take it any longer. And they charge out of the city and down the hill at night. And it says that this was the only possible way that Arthur's army could have won the battle, is that they needed to leave the city, they needed to charge, and needed to be at night, where it was harder for them to take advantage of their superior numbers. And after harsh fighting, Arthur wins the battle. Uh, it's an incredible scene. It's brilliantly written, brilliant message. I love everything about it. The whole thing is great. So I love the Pendragon cycle. Its flaws aside, it's still very good. Uh, of the main series, the worst book is probably Grail, and even Grail has a lot going for it. Uh, but he wrote a book called Avalon. And last time that we talked, we had a discussion of works that our authors wrote that we weren't satisfied with, and so wrote our own things as a way of saying, well, I can do that better. I did this with Avalon. Tales of the Once and Future King was actually a response to Stephen Lawhead's book Avalon. Because Avalon, as you can imagine, is sort of a postscript. This is why I said 5 or 6 books. Depending on if you count Avalon as part of the Pendragon cycle, it's either the 6th book in the series or just a sort of like postscript epilogue book. And obviously, as you could probably guess by the title, if you know anything about the Arthurian legends, it's about the return of King Arthur, right? But
Right.
when is King Arthur supposed to return? Well, he's supposed to return in Britain's hour of greatest need, right?
Yep.
So, my problem with the book is this. What do you think Stephen Lawhead figured Britain's hour of greatest need would be?
So I cannot remember whether or not he's shit lib or not. Uh,
He's not. He's a
okay.
Christian.
So thing is that like to me personally, what's happening in England is England's greatest hour of need. It is once again being invaded. Like I cannot like maybe Nazi Germany, actually getting over the channel, but in the
That's
end,
fair.
like I
It's a
can
fair thought, and your thought of like, oh, the modern day because of like modern invaders or whatever. Like, that's also a fair thought. That is not what Stephen Lawhead did, though.
the aliens.
He did it in the modern day, but his reasoning, it was technically like near future, but modern day, right?
Right.
His reasoning was that the figurehead monarchy of England was about to be voted out of existence. And that was his idea of Britain's hour of greatest need, is that the monarchy is about to be voted away because the last king was a degenerate who dies in Portugal, like drunk.
So King Charles.
Uh, yeah, a little bit, right? But he dies in Portugal. He's a drunk. He's a drunk and a degenerate who dies overseas, and it looks as if the British monarchy is about to be voted out. And this is the incident that Stephen Lawhead says this is Britain's hour of greatest need. Britain's figurehead monarchy is about to be voted away. Like,
Mm,
and so we need King Arthur to return and restore the monarchy to its former glory, except not really,
right.
because he doesn't like. The thing is that his new Arthur, who is a guy named James Arthur, who's a Stewart, James Arthur Stewart,
Right.
uh, his new Arthur isn't actually trying to restore the monarchy to its former glory, right? Like, its former glory would mean that the monarch had real authority, and he's not trying to bring back real authority. He's trying to bring back some sort of authority, but it seems like he's most concerned with making sure that the monarchy just isn't eliminated entirely. And to me, that's such a boring conflict for like King Arthur is going to return and you make the centerpiece of it an election, like an election. That just seems so contra, I don't know, King Arthur to me,
Right.
right? Like,
Like Arthur would care about an election. He was elected by God already. Why are the peasants talking about this, stuff?
right, exactly. And it's just such a weird thing where it's like, this is your idea of, Nazi Germany, modern Britain's, current the current attempt by frankly Muslims to supplant London, right?
Right.
Uh,
And
all of
Hindus.
this stuff, and you're like, but the figurehead monarch is going to be voted out, so we need Arthur to return to win an election. Like it's so boring, you know. I'm like, I don't understand the stakes here. Like, what exactly is going to happen if Arthur doesn't win? Like, why is it
Mm-hmm.
such a bad thing? And the closest he comes to arguing this is that someone on Arthur's team, his like court, I guess you could say, uh, like someone on Arthur's court basically says something along the lines of, "Honestly, does it really matter who wins or not?" And Merlin, who by the way is still alive, and he's like an immortal who's now working with Arthur, which I don't care about. I think that's a cool idea, to be honest with you. But anyway, Merlin, who is still alive, like raises his voice and says something like, "If anybody else agrees with what he says, leave now." You know, and like that's the entire argument. And it's like, okay, that's great that you feel so strongly about this, but I actually would have liked to hear an answer to the question, like why? Why does it matter? What do you expect him to do? You know,
Mm.
like I guess that's my point. When you have this figurehead monarchy, it's like, oh, the prime minister is going to meet with the monarch once a week, and he mentioned something about like social reform. So it's very limp wristed too.
Right.
Uh, right? Like, what is Arthur going to do? Is he going to drive out the immigrants? Is he going to, this was
Right.
pre-Brexit. Is he going to exit the European? No, he talks about like, and I'm going to institute social reforms, and he doesn't say what they are. right? So I can't really accuse him of being liberal because I don't even know what he's talking about. Like, what does social reforms mean? Why is it so important that the ability for a monarch to discuss social reforms with the prime minister is preserved?
Right.
Like, I don't get it. So that's why I said if I was going to do Britain's, this was Tales of the Once and Future King, where I said if I'm going to do Britain's Hour of Greatest Need, you know, I mean, John C. Wright, his opinion is that like that refers to the end of time, and I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation, right? Like, don't get
Right.
me wrong, that makes perfect sense to me. Uh, but like I said I wanted to be genuinely bad, so I said like it's gonna be post-apocalyptic, right? So like the apocalypse has happened, Britain is getting invaded, by an opposing force, uh, and the entire country has completely fallen apart. And now you would want Arthur's return. Like that's an exciting reason for Arthur to return. Not, oh, the monarch won't be able to meet with the prime minister once a week anymore. They'll just be a fabulously rich and influential family.
Yep.
Like, okay, you're gonna have to explain to me why I'm supposed to care about this. The
Yep.
thing about Avalon's that I would hesitate to call it an outright bad book, but I just have an issue with like what it's doing from the concept phase. Like, and what's weird to me is that Lawhead at least comes across, he is an author, so maybe he's just playing it up, but he at least comes across as a pretty strong monarchist, right?
Right.
So surely, given that, you have some sort of reason you would give for why it is important to have a monarch, right? But he just seems to like assume that it's the case.
Yeah.
The monarchy is so important to British identity and character that you can't just get rid of it. And okay, I agree with that to an extent, but like you're, in a book, there needs to be stakes.
Yep.
The stakes can't be that abstract, right? Like
Right.
he reminds me of reading Tim Powers. Oh, I can't remember the name of it, but the Drawing of the Dark. That was it. The Drawing of the Dark, which was a pretty good book. I think they ended on a bit of an anticlimax, so it was overall good. But one thing that he does is it's also about the return of King Arthur. The premise of the story is that Arthur returns at various points in Western civilization's history that all count as its hour of greatest need. And this particular story was set during the Battle of Vienna, the Great Siege of Vienna with the charge of the winged Tsars,
Yes.
right? And I think that's a fantastic idea, right?
Yes.
Like, brilliant. Uh, I think the story ends on a bit of an anticlimax, so it's an overall good book. Uh, but that's the thing, where it's like Arthur is doing something concrete in the story. Like it's not an abstract, like, oh, the character of the West will fall. No, it's Vienna is going to fall to Ottoman invaders, right? Like,
Right.
and the West will collapse. The Christianity will die on the vine if you don't do what you need to do here, right? And it's
Yep.
like, so what is the equivalent stakes of what happens if Arthur doesn't win this election, right? Or
Right.
James, technically the name of the character. Like, what is the equivalent stake? You know,
Right.
if he loses, is Britain going to collapse? How fundamentally are things going to be different? Like, you haven't like it would be interesting if he said something like, oh, maybe there's like a foreign threat that that you need the monarch there to mobilize them, right?
Yes.
But no, he brings up social reforms and very vague social reforms, just like,
Right.
I like the poor people. Uh, where it's like, okay,
Thank you,
that's
Anthony.
great. What was that?
Thank you, Anthony. Glad to hear
I love me some poor people. Uh,
it.
like it's just kind of weird where it's like, okay, so if you lose this election, what will happen? Like, they won't have a monarchy anymore. Okay, right, but why is that relevant? What does that mean? Like, you need to tell me what this means.
Right.
Like, I even think this sort of story sort of could have worked if it were like, the prime minister. You do, honestly, like, as weird as it sounds, an example I'll use is Harry Potter, right? Where they have in the fifth book, the Minister of Magic is doing everything he can to avoid admitting that Voldemort has returned, and
Sure.
Harry's out there telling everyone, no, like, Voldemort's return, we need to mobilize or we're all going to die. That's real stakes to the story. You could do something like that,
Right.
where it's like there are invaders who are planning on fighting the country, and the prime minister, could be corrupt in bed with the invaders or something, and going, no, there's no threat. There's no real threat. We don't need to do anything, like a Neville Chamberlain type, except that
Mm-hmm.
Neville Chamberlain wasn't actually corrupt.
Yep.
Uh, Neville Chamberlain wasn't corrupt. Neville Chamberlain was just an unfortunate in the wrong place at the wrong time. But you get my point, right?
Right.
Like, if you do something like that, and then you go, if Arthur loses, invaders are actually going to come in and destroy Britain unless, the monarch can do something to stop it. Which, even then, that would also imply stronger powers than the monarch actually
Yep.
has in Britain today. But that would work for a story like this, where he's going like, yeah, Britain needs its monarch, right? Like,
Right.
even modern Britain needs its monarch for your fictional story. But he doesn't do any of that. He just assumes that, having a monarchy is a crisis of such an extent that it would justify the return of King Arthur. And just my first thought was, really? Not Nazi Germany?
Right.
Like, that seems like a bigger deal to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little naive. Or, like, that time that King Alfred the Great uh, was basically holed up with a few barons in the south of England against, like, the entirety of the Saxon forces. And through sheer force of will and incredible leadership, managed to rally England to retake the country. Like, I feel like Arthur would have been very useful in that situation, you know.
Yep.
But that I guess that wasn't it either.
And it's
It's also, I'll
yeah.
add one other thing too, that why this is strange, and it's that the monarchy of Britain isn't even like, technically speaking, it's not even the correct monarchy. It was already overthrown.
Yeah.
So it's like the monarchy of Britain is, Arthur is returning just to ensure that Britain has some sort of monarchy.
I
Like,
mean, like
like
there is a novel where Arthur fights Cromwell in a pike and shot war. Like, there it's there. It's there for people who want to write it, but anyway, keep going.
yeah, I don't have much more to this. It's just it's just a strange book. It's not bad per
Mm,
se, right? Like,
of
it's
course.
it's well written. The characters are entertaining enough, and Lawhead is just a good overall author. Uh, Again, like, it felt like missed potential to me, and there's just something very, like, again, the whole monarchy angle too. It's like, it seems, forgetting the fact that in the history of Britain, the monarchy has been overthrown multiple times,
Yep.
and replaced with other monarchs and things like that. So it seems like Arthur's return is based on just Britain having any monarch, like, not even the rightful monarch, just a monarch
Yep.
needs to be controlling Britain. That's the important thing. And it's like, that's weird and not in keeping with what monarchy has been historically. And the
Yep.
reason I say this is because if it didn't just mean any monarch, then he would have returned at one of the other times that the monarchy was overthrown. And not just that one time they decided to vote it out.
Yep.
Like,
Which they've already
otherwise, apparent.
done. So, you
Yeah,
know.
like, I feel like you missed your chance here. The monarchy was already overthrown. Like, why didn't you come? Like you said, why didn't you come during Cromwell? Like, I feel like you could have been very useful when Cromwell was in power.
Yep. Not that I think
I don't
Cromwell
know.
did anything wrong, because King Charles was a tyrant, but it's when it comes to things
Getting
like this,
spicy at Cromwell did nothing wrong.
is that?
Getting spicy at Cromwell did nothing wrong.
I'll actually fight on that one, but with like King Henry is Henry VIII is a meme. Cromwell is big, uh, especially before he took power. Specifically, like you have to kind of divide up. I absolutely approve of what he did to the Irish, but
For the record, I have not looked up Cromwell in any detail, so I can neither argue for or against your position.
yep, yep.
I only know the very bare minimum of, Cromwell took over the government, then was taken over again, then was defeated again.
No, he wasn't defeated. He died, and his son's like, I don't want to do this.
Oh, I thought he was defeated. I guess I
Nope.
was wrong.
His son gave up power, and they brought back King Charles II because Cromwell was a bit of a dick and very serious and Puritan. Um, but the reason why I bring up Cromwell and other things is that, yeah, there are times when, you know, they that are like that matter more. Like the problems that we have today didn't start, with what happened last year. It started with what happened to those poor girls in Rotherham. But even then, it didn't start with those poor girls in Rotherham. It started, you know, way, way back. Like my mother and father have a story of them going door to door in a Hindu, I think it was a Hindu part of England, and this is in the 1970s before I'm born, like really early 1980s. And my dad, who is a bit of a swarthy German, uh, was going door to door, escorting my mother, and they were being followed by these men. And because my dad has some Semitic features, they're like, we thought you were a Muslim, but we allowed you to go on because you're Christian, and not one of the Muslims that we're feuding with. So like the problems that they were having, have sources before and before and before. So it's like when you write one of these books, that it's like, well, what's the danger problem? Well, sure, Darkest Hour, but couldn't you rather not lead a genocide of every non-Briton in England and instead have come back to prevent the boats from landing, maybe? Like it's one of those things where it's like the implications are not great. Uh especially
Kind of. Yeah, I mean there is the point too where you have to be like Arthur can only, in theory, unless you're going with the route that what's his name? Staples, was that it? Or
hmm?
the one who wrote the Drawing of the Dark. I just blanked on his name.
Olaf Stapleton.
Uh yeah, whatever. The one who unless you're going by his thing where Arthur returns at each point of danger,
Right.
uh you
Which is
you
which is
can only
a
pick.
very nice thing, by the way. I like it.
Yeah, which is a great idea. I think very clever, but like unless you're going with that, Arthur can only return once, right?
Yes.
So you could always say that, like, well, I guess this wasn't the darkest hour yet. Uh, John C. Wright's idea is also quite smart, I think, which is Arthur will return with the other sleeping kings at the end of time.
Yes.
Arthur and Charlemagne and things like that. I think that's a clever idea as well, and nicely solves the writing problem. Uh, my idea was simply that if it's going to be the hour of greatest need, then logically speaking, what needs to happen needs to be much much worse than anything that's happened already. So I said,
Yep.
all right, there was an EMF, there was or an EMP, not EMF, EMP, that
The
wiped
EMF
out
is
all
also
electron.
bad.
Yeah, well, EMP though. There was an EMP that wiped out electronics. There was a war that wiped out the country. The entire infrastructure of the world broke down, and uh, invaders are coming, right? Like just about as bad as it could possibly be in theory. because that was my thought process, was like Arthur needs to return logically at a time that has literally never been worse. So it's an unprecedented series of disasters, one after another. But
Mm-hmm.
either way, you need to make a decision, right? Like, what does it mean for it to be the worst? The greatest hour of greatest need. And the figurehead monarchy of Britain is being voted out does not pass the sniff test to me.
It doesn't. Like it's yeah. No, I got nothing for you. I absolutely agree with that. Just because it's like there's you know even beyond the science fiction, there have been times when it's like yeah. So what about when this happened or what that happened, or what about the fact that our civilization is going down the toilet fast as thought, and all this other stuff that why didn't he stop the CIA from being but it's thoroughly reductive, and I think it's honestly just better to make up a fake one about the world falling apart than it is to actually, you know, not have lesser stakes than the highest possible.
Yeah, it's I agree with this. Like in the books too, it's also weird because at previous when like when Arthur comes originally in the story, right?
Mm.
It's like England is divided among uh several warring groups, and there are invaders. So it's like you have
And
all of these
famine, and
problems.
and
Yeah,
worse.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you have all of these problems that only a man like Arthur, right,
Yep.
can possibly do anything about, and he calls it like the children of summer, his kingdom of summer, sorry, right, like his promised kingdom of summer. Uh, so it just seems weird that he does this when Arthur comes originally, right? He absolutely makes the threat seem credible, right? England is
Mm-hmm.
and Britain generally, because Stephen Lawhead is famously Welsh and very pro Welsh.
Mm.
So, but he makes Britain and Arthur does originate the very earliest Arthur stories do originate from the Mabinogion, so that's Welsh. Uh, but anyway, like he very credibly presents Britain as like on the verge of absolute total collapse to invaders, right?
Right.
Uh, and to internal strife, uh, which only an Arthur can possibly stop. But then years later, like it's like he doesn't do that when he has the opportunity. And it's like, why? I know you can. You did it once. Like, do you really think this is the best use of Arthur's talents? Like, you didn't think it would have been more useful if he showed up when the Nazis attacked?
Yep.
It's weird. On the other hand, I think that the idea of him coming and during all of these various periods of history and like coming in secret to fight like the secret war, that's the true war, you know, that's a genius idea. Uh,
Right.
it's so good. It's one that I wish I had thought of because I absolutely would have used it.
Yep.
Unfortunately, by the way, The Drawing of the Dark, quick review, good book. It ends in a bit of an anticlimax, I think. Uh, the returned Arthur in this version, like, it's sort of, they combine it with like a semi reincarnation thing, but also it's not reincarnation. He like a person is born who's going to fulfill that role, but Arthur possesses them. It's a
Right.
little weird, Uh,
I always hated that
wi-
sort of thing. It's like, so was the person a blank? No, no, they were an ensouled person. So what about the soul? The
yeah,
soul that
it's
was there.
Lawhead sort of does this too. I the way I viewed it in my stories on it, I viewed it as they were going to fill the same roles.
Hmm.
So my new Arthur, who I had named Michael, and This is all stuff that I will possibly one day write. I'm very happy that Tales of the Once and Future King was published because
Yeah.
it brought a little bit of that world to life that I have more plans for. So maybe I could do it one day. But my
I
idea was
dream
that
of
they
you
were
publishing
fulfilling.
more, Anthony.
What was that?
I dream of you publishing more.
Yeah, well, keep dreaming. Uh, no, I get your point. But yeah, the idea that I had was that they were fulfilling the same roles in the story. They were not the same people. Uh, in any like in no sense of the word were they the same people. They weren't reincarnations or anything of the sort. But in a situation where it required men of the same caliber fulfilling the same roles, they were fulfilling those roles. Uh, the closest I came to sharing a name was that the new Lancelot figure was named Lance, which if I were writing it today, I probably would not do.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, mistakes you make when you're younger. What can I tell you? Uh, but now it's there, it's published, and he is who he is. So Lance lives. Uh, but yeah, I had other figures like my Arthur figure was named Michael. Uh, my Merlin figure was named Bennett, and I was going to eventually make him a priest, uh, which I actually think fits kind of where Merlin was heading, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Like, so Merlin was not a priest, he was not clergy. He represented, I think Lewis does this well. He was like a holdover of the old pagan religions, not quite Christianized, but working for Christianity. So I would think if you were to have a Merlin today, he would need to go all the way and just be in the clergy. Like he's now representing entirely the forces of good, you know, on a
Yes.
supernatural level. So clergy would make sense. You know, uh, so I was going to make my Merlin figure. He was going to become a priest. And I had all of these ideas for later stories in the series that he would. I'm gonna tell you this, and this is just to make conversation because now we're pretty much done with the main topic, right? So,
Yeah.
uh, but I'm gonna tell you this as this is an idea that I had that I am absolutely planning on doing one day because I love the premise of this, and it was that Bennett, who is the Merlin figure, gets a prophecy or here receives, you know, a vision, a prophecy, or something of the future that, like in the Camelot of old, now like they have successfully driven out the invaders and have established a kingdom and things are going well. But he receives this prophecy that, like in the Camelot of old, that the Guinevere figure, Maddie, who is going to tear apart Camelot by having an affair with the greatest with Michael, who is the new Arthur's greatest knight, who is Lance. And now, with this knowledge, he needs to decide what to do with it.
Mm.
Right? Like that he has gotten this prophecy that these people who he is friends with, he has
Right.
just been told that they are going to do something that is going to cause the total collapse of everything that he holds that they hold dear in a way that is similar to what happened originally, but with the difference that this time he has advanced knowledge of what is going to happen. So he needs to make a decision. What should he do? Should he tell them about this prophecy? If he does, should he try and separate them? Should he try and stop it? Or will that cause it to happen? I think this is a great premise, and one day I'm going to use it.
Yep. There's a. I don't think there's
Go ahead.
I don't think there's enough subtle prophecy stories, that are in the world. It's like either yeah, we're prophesied, but it happened a little weird, a little bit different, but totally the same outcome. Uh, you know, uh, I really don't like those type of prophecy stories.
The
Just
question to me about this is that they are. essentially trying to fulfill the roles that Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table did originally in uniting Britain and stabilizing the country and bringing a reign of peace and prosperity. The problem with this is if they are fulfilling those same roles, the question is, are they destined to make the same mistakes
Yep.
and fail in the same way or not? That's
Right.
what's interesting about this story to me. Where
Exactly.
you go, okay, for this greatness to appear, do you also need to have those failures
Mm.
wrapped up in it?
Right.
And if you want, my personal opinion is nothing is inevitable, right? Like,
Right.
however, on the other hand, we're not if we're not at the end times, all nations collapse, right?
Right.
All governments fail. Nothing lasts forever but the kingdom of God.
Right.
So, but what does this mean for the people involved, right? Like, are we fated to continually fail even if we know the same mistakes? Do we need to make them again?
Right.
And the prophecy angle here, I think, just concretizes that question, if that's a word that makes sense to you.
It does.
Yeah. It makes the abstract question of, are we destined to continue making those same mistakes, concrete, right?
Mm.
Like, do we need to do this? Do we need to doom our ancestors, to doom our kingdom? Is Mordred and Avalon and the affair of Guinevere and Lancelot, is this all inevitable to the court of Arthur,
Right.
right?
Like there's to me like thinking about Mordred, there is a solid question, line of thought that says that if Mordred had been brought in as the king's bastard son, Mordred would not have turned out the way he had been turned out. If he had, instead of being stuck with his witch mother,
I
um,
agree.
the entire time, he would have been brought in, and it's like, yes, I have made a mistake. I will now make a pilgrimage to such and such a place where I will pray for forgiveness, but we will train my son up, who, though born in sin, has no sin imputed to him. And he will become the greatest knight in the realm. Etc. Like there's a way to treat him that
Yep.
has a way to sort of remove the certain natures that he developed
That was
as
always my
mm,
problem with T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which I think is a great book, by the way, like, for the
oh yeah,
record. Especially, I think The Ill-Made Knight is probably the second best fantasy novel ever written, to The Lord of the Rings.
yep,
Uh, it's an incredible book. Like, it's an achievement. So keep in mind that as I say criticism, I am criticizing it from that perspective of, I think it's a masterpiece, right?
mm,
But one of the things that I did disagree with in the book is that he makes the point at the end of The Queen of Air and Darkness that everything that happened was ultimately inevitable because Arthur was tricked into sleeping with his half sister. And I don't agree with that.
yep,
Even based on White's narrative, right? Even by his rules, I don't agree with that.
right,
Because that to me was not the thing that caused everything to spiral out of control. The thing that caused the spiraling to happen was when Arthur tried to eliminate his mistakes.
yep,
He tried to murder all of the children, and he admits this. Like, he says it outright, like that he tried to drown essentially like all of the children who could have potentially been his son.
yep,
Now that is a despicable act, and to be fair to the story, like Arthur himself calls it a despicable act. Now, Lancelot and Guinevere are weirdly blasé about this, though I suppose the reason that they are is now Arthur is an old man who they've known for a very long time, right? Like, and
right,
what are you going to do about it? Like, it's kind of over now.
yep.
Uh,
There's also the
but
thing
Arthur,
that T.H. White had weird ideas about original sin and stuff like
He
that.
did, yes.
So,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is kind of connected to my point, right?
yep,
But Arthur is very like he says himself like that he knows that what he did was like absolutely evil, you know. So in fairness to him, right?
yes,
He doesn't try and sugarcoat his own flaws, but that's the thing where I go like I don't think it was Arthur being tricked into sleeping with his half sister that is the cause of all of this. If he had owned up to what had happened and actually acted like a Christian man and asked for forgiveness and raised his son, right?
yep,
That could have prevented things. But he doesn't. He runs away from his problems in the most evil way he possibly could, and this is what causes Mordred to be raised and act the way he does.
yep,
And it is one of the achievements of T.H. White that Mordred does come off, to me at least, as a very believable character in White's version. You
yes,
know, twisted by his mother into, I mean, I hate to use the word gamma, but yeah,
yeah.
right? Like, kind of the quintessential gamma, right?
Oh,
Of course, the
absolutely.
actual, well, actually, the quintessential gamma in the story, as weird as this sounds, is Lancelot. Uh,
Mm.
I will argue that point in the ill-made knight. Uh, in the ill-made knight, I think that Lancelot is primarily characterized as a gamma.
I will have to reread it.
But either way, yeah, Mordred
Yeah,
definitely is though. Uh, right, like, and I
yes,
think it's a very very believable way of characterizing him. Uh,
yeah. Like to me,
but
it's always like the way it is the way that T.H. White presents it. It has always felt like very believable. But
yeah,
then like I look at it from like a certain like real practical, sort of idea, and it's like, why in the world, even if they hated King Arthur, would they follow this little gamma brat, to this war against
well,
Arthur?
I think that was kind of part of the point of what was going on at that point of the story.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like it doesn't feel
I'm trying to
bad
think
in
of,
story. I'm just saying the concept has always rankled me.
yeah, I think the idea is that Camelot had devolved to such a point,
Yeah.
right, that people were willing to follow Mordred,
Yes.
you know. And part of this is the failure of Arthur in the story. Arthur is characterized early on as being willing to engage in total war if necessary in order to control his kingdom. Like
Mm.
White goes out of his way to even call it total war and say that Arthur created total war. Uh, Now it was not. I don't think what he was describing was really total war, but he says it was. Uh,
Total war for
like
medieval people, I guess.
maybe, yeah. Like so, Arthur is originally characterized as a warrior, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he is willing to fight and kill in order to do what he needs to do. But then later, like I don't know, the way Arthur's whole reign is characterized by him trying to avoid the biggest problems that are arising around him, right? He knows that Lancelot and Guinevere are having an affair. It's very clear in the final book
Oh
that he
yeah.
pretty much always knew. And he is intentionally avoiding it because they say, because he loves Lancelot and Guinevere, right? Like, he
Right.
doesn't want to believe it. And he doesn't want to execute them, for that matter, which he knows he will have to do.
Yep.
But that's cowardly, right? Like,
Yep.
Arthur is the king. Just because you like someone, it doesn't mean that you can let them get away with cuckolding you behind your back,
Yep.
right? Like publicly in a way that everyone knows it. And it's this failure that leads to people following Mordred because Arthur looks weak.
Yep.
Because it is weak. Like they're not even really wrong, right? Like
Right.
uh it's incredibly weak. It makes you doubt the person who is supposedly your leader. But of course, that's part of the point too, which is that he doesn't want people to follow him because he's the strongest. He wants people to follow him because he's right. But then it's like, but you're not administering justice.
Yep.
The justice that you claim you should be administering, you're avoiding doing that. And I get the idea of like, oh, well, there's also mercy, right? But you're not showing mercy either. You're just pretending it's not happening. Like it's just an avoidance of the problem. And it's the same thing that he did with Mordred, right? It's the same flaw. This idea that you can just avoid the problem, act like it doesn't exist, and then it will, you won't need to worry about it. And of
Right.
course, it's like with Lancelot and Guinevere, Mordred comes back to bite him. But yeah, I love the Once and Future King. It's a great book.
It is.
Uh, Also, T.H. White is the absolute master of titles. Every title in that book is fantastic, and
Yep.
the overall cycle title is fantastic. The Queen of Air and Darkness is a 10 of 10 title.
Oh yeah. Ill-Made Night is for me the big one. But it's just every single one of his titles are bangers. Absolute amazing pieces. Um,
They are. You could, if you want to learn how to make a good title, you could do better than to learn, or do worse than to learn from T.H. White.
yep. Uh,
Anything you want to say? Well, before we close it out.
yeah, I mean it's Eldritch fan destined to make the same mistakes. Yeah, probably. Uh, to me, a lot of what makes Arthurian legend, especially, Arthurian legend, isn't headcanon or some other series of weird ideas that the author wants to put in, like not having original sin or mercy as, is disguised as, weakness disguised as mercy. I think it works best, when it's a quasi spiritual journey about the physical and the spiritual being entwined together. One of the reasons
Yep,
why,
and that's the Ill-Made Night.
yep, and part of the reason why I think A24's Green Knight is a bit better, at least a bit truer than people want to put forward. Like it has tons of problems, but it's a bit truer than people might want to say, is because in the end it's a spiritual journey for Gawain, um, who is faced with the fact that he in this version, he's just a weak, nephew of the king, reliant on his mother's witchcraft, even though he refuses it at the end, even though he stays with the Green Knight, even though he has his own choices to make. It's pretty clear that the spiritual nature of the journey is as intense as the physical perils that he experiences throughout his time, um, as a wanderer. And I think that in general, if you're looking at King Arthur's stuff, you should definitely keep the spiritual in mind, uh, especially since you can assume that every single one of the scholars who wrote King Arthur stories, considering they were monks, was more spiritually educated than even, I would say, some priests. It's these guys copied the Bible by hand constantly. I think they might have picked up a few spiritual things along the way, hopefully. Um, Unless they're illiterate and just copying the shapes. How about you, Anthony? You have anything else?
Do I have? No, I said what I wanted to say about both Conan Doyle and Stephen Lawhead.
Very
Last
good.
thing I guess I'll say is I am still a huge Stephen Lawhead fan. Absolutely awesome author. I've been thinking that probably his Robin Hood trilogy is even better than his Pendragon cycle lately, which is saying a lot because I was a very, very big fan of the Pendragon cycle. Uh, it's great. So highly recommend. And I'll also say that the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, I don't know if I would go so far as to call it bad either.
The
The best that I can
Bellmaker
say is
is
that it
bad.
has, yeah, exactly. Like the best I can say about it though is that there are sporadic moments in it of interesting stuff.
Mm.
right? Like interesting ideas, interesting moments, clearly
Possibly
stuff
even
that
some brilliance.
yes, like the whole section of your life is not your own, keep your hands off it is brilliant. Brilliant line, very powerful to read. Uh but it's the way that I look at the casebook is that I think that those are the things that drew him to make the stories, and the rest of the stories don't really hold up on their own, right? Like you're just wading through kind of okay stories to get to these sporadic moments of genius that are occasionally peppered in there, and you
Mm-hmm.
can contrast this with all of the stories in the memoirs and adventures, which are all fantastic, like beginning to end. There are no bad stories in the adventures or memoirs. They're all worth reading.
Mm. Yep. All right. Don't read Bellmaker if you're reading Redwall unless you really want to read it. All right. Have a good night, guys.